The year was 1896, and across the rolling highlands of northern Ethiopia, the morning mist clung to ancient mountains like whispered prayers. But this was no ordinary dawn breaking over the Horn of Africa. On March 1st, beneath skies that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms for millennia, two worlds were about to collide in a battle that would shatter every assumption Europe held about African resistance. At the heart of this storm stood Emperor Menelik II, a man whose name would soon echo through history as the architect of one of the most stunning military victories the world had ever seen. Beside him, equally formidable, was Empress Taytu, a strategic mastermind whose brilliant mind would prove as deadly to the enemy as any rifle or cannon. Together, they commanded an army that European observers had dismissed as primitive, backward, incapable of standing against the might of modern warfare. Their enemy advanced with the confidence of conquerors. Italian forces under General Oreste Baratieri marched through the Ethiopian highlands, certain that superior European military technology and discipline would sweep aside any resistance. After all, this was the age of the scramble for Africa, when European powers carved up an entire continent with ruthless efficiency. By 1896, virtually every African kingdom had fallen to European guns. Ethiopia stood alone, the last great African empire to resist the tide of colonization, but the Italians had made a fatal miscalculation. They believed they faced a feudal army armed with spears and shields, led by a barbaric king who could barely comprehend modern warfare. What they actually confronted was something far more dangerous. A unified Ethiopian force equipped with thousands of modern rifles, trained artillery crews, and a leadership that had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. The roots of this conflict stretched back 7 years, to a diplomatic catastrophe that would ignite one of history's most decisive battles. In 1889, representatives of Italy and Ethiopia had signed what appeared to be a friendship treaty at the small town of Wuchale. On paper, it seemed straightforward enough. Two nations agreeing to peaceful relations and mutual cooperation. But buried within Article 17 of that document lay a translation so catastrophic, so deliberately deceptive, that it would lead directly to war. The Italian version of the treaty stated unequivocally that Ethiopia must conduct all foreign relations through Italian authorities. In effect, this made Ethiopia an Italian protectorate, a vassal state stripped of sovereignty. But the Amharic version told a completely different story. In Ethiopia's language, the treaty merely offered Italy as an option for diplomatic communication, granting Emperor Menelik the choice of whether or not to use Italian channels for foreign affairs. When Menelik attempted to establish direct diplomatic relations with European powers in 1890, the shocking truth emerged. Queen Victoria of Britain curtly informed him that Italy had notified all European governments that Ethiopia was now an Italian protectorate. The German Kaiser insulted Menelik by addressing him as Your Highness rather than Emperor, making clear that Germany no longer recognized Ethiopian independence. The duplicity was breathtaking. Italy had deliberately mistranslated the treaty, then used that false translation to claim sovereignty over an empire that had never surrendered its independence. For Menelik, a ruler who had spent his entire reign modernizing and strengthening Ethiopia, this betrayal was not merely political, it was personal. Behind the scenes, Empress Taytu recognized the threat immediately. Where others might have counseled negotiation or compromise, she understood that Italy's ambitions could never be satisfied through diplomacy. She was the first to tear up the fraudulent treaty, the first to urge her husband toward armed resistance. Her educational background was extraordinary for a woman of her time. Fluent in Amharic and capable of reading ancient Ge'ez texts, she possessed an intellect that European diplomats consistently underestimated. While Italy plotted Ethiopia's subjugation, Menelik and Taytu embarked on a campaign of military modernization that would prove decisive. Through careful diplomacy, Menelik played European powers against each other, securing massive shipments of modern weapons. France, eager to counter Italian expansion, provided thousands of rifles and artillery pieces. Russia, seeking to limit European colonial expansion, supplied additional armaments. Even Italy itself, through the Brussels Act of 1890, had ironically legitimized Ethiopia's legal right to import weapons. By the mid-1890s, Ethiopian forces possessed an estimated 100,000 modern rifles, many of them superior to the weapons carried by Italian troops. Hotchkiss artillery pieces, capable of rapid fire, gave Ethiopian gunners a crucial advantage over slower Italian cannons. Ethiopian officers had received training from European advisors, while traditional military structures were adapted to incorporate modern tactics and equipment. Yet Menelik's greatest weapon was perhaps his strategic deception. He deliberately leaked false reports, suggesting his army was much smaller than reality, spreading rumors of discord among his forces. European intelligence services, blinded by racial prejudice, eagerly believed these reports. They could not conceive that an African ruler might possess the sophistication to conduct psychological warfare against European powers. As tensions escalated through 1895, Italian forces began advancing from their base in Eritrea. General Baratieri commanded approximately 17,000 men, supported by artillery and confident in their technological superiority. Rome had calculated that 35,000 soldiers could control all of Ethiopia. The mathematics seemed simple: European discipline and firepower against African chaos and primitiveness, but the mathematics were catastrophically wrong. Menelik had mobilized between 73,000 and 100,000 troops, the vast majority equipped with modern weapons. More importantly, these were not the disorganized tribal levies that Europeans expected. Ethiopian forces were organized into disciplined brigades under experienced commanders. Negus Tekle Haimano commanded the right wing with troops from Gojam. Ras Mengesha led the left with forces from Tigray. Ras Makonnen commanded the center, while Ras Mikhail controlled the Wollo Oromo cavalry. The Ethiopian war machine that assembled in early 1896 was unlike anything Europeans had encountered in Africa. This was not a desperate last stand by a dying kingdom. This was a modern army, led by brilliant strategists, fighting for the independence of their ancient homeland. General Baratieri, despite his confidence, faced challenges that should have given him pause. His supply lines stretched hundreds of miles through hostile territory. His maps were unreliable, his intelligence was compromised, and his men suffered from inadequate food, water, and equipment. Pressure from Rome demanded immediate action, but military reality counseled patience. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just Ethiopia's fate, but the future of European colonial expansion across Africa. In the highlands around Adwa, two armies prepared for battle. One represented the seemingly unstoppable force of European imperialism. The other embodied the fierce determination of a people who refused to surrender their freedom. Neither side fully grasped what was about to unfold. The Italians expected a quick victory followed by the systematic colonization of Ethiopia. The Ethiopians knew they faced the fight of their lives, but even they could not have predicted the magnitude of their coming triumph. History was about to witness something unprecedented in the age of European expansion. An outnumbered African army was about to deliver one of the most devastating military defeats in colonial history. The final weeks of February 1896 witnessed a deadly game of cat and mouse across the Ethiopian highlands. General Baratieri, acutely aware of his precarious position, had established defensive positions near the town of Adwa, hoping to force Menelik into attacking fortified Italian lines. His strategy was sound in theory. Let the Ethiopians exhaust themselves against prepared defenses, then counterattack with disciplined European firepower. But Empress Taytu had anticipated exactly this tactic. Her network of spies, carefully cultivated over months of preparation, fed her detailed intelligence about Italian movements and intentions. She knew Baratieri expected the Ethiopians to attack at Adigrat, near the Eritrean border where Italian supply lines were shortest and most secure. Instead, she convinced Menelik to force the battle at Adwa, drawing the Italians away from their logistical advantages into terrain of Ethiopian choosing. The psychological pressure on Baratieri was immense. Rome had grown impatient with his cautious approach, viewing his defensive posture as cowardice. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi sent increasingly hostile telegrams demanding immediate action. Italian newspapers questioned Whether their general possessed the courage to face African warriors, the political costs of inaction were mounting daily, while military supplies dwindled with each passing week. On February 28th, Crispi's fury exploded in a telegram that would seal Italy's fate. He accused Baratieri of cowardice, threatened his career, and demanded that he advance immediately or face disgrace at home. The general, his pride wounded and his options exhausted, called a council of war with his brigade commanders. Initially favoring retreat, he was swayed by subordinates who argued that withdrawal would destroy Italian prestige forever. The decision to advance was made not through military logic, but through political desperation. Baratieri ordered his forces to march on Adwa with 14,500 men, convinced he faced at most 30,000 Ethiopians. His intelligence had failed him completely. Ethiopian deception operations had worked flawlessly, leaving the Italians blind to the true size and capability of the force awaiting them. As Italian columns began their approach march on the night of February 29th, Menelik's forces were already in position. The emperor had chosen his ground with the eye of a master tactician. The terrain around Adwa was broken and difficult, unsuited for the kind of coordinated European maneuvers that had proven so effective elsewhere in Africa. Steep hills and narrow valleys would channel Italian advances into killing zones where superior numbers could overwhelm technological advantages. The Ethiopian deployment was a masterpiece of military organization. Unlike the chaotic tribal gatherings Europeans expected, Menelik's army moved with precision and discipline. Each regional force knew its role. Each commander understood the overall strategy. Communication systems using traditional horn signals and drum beats allowed coordination across vast distances. While European observers dismissed these methods as primitive noise, Taytu positioned herself with a personal guard of 5,000 men, ready to plug any gap in the Ethiopian line. Around her, she had organized over 10,000 women to serve crucial support roles. They carried water to fighting men, tended the wounded, and maintained supply lines that kept Ethiopian forces operational throughout the coming battle. In the arid climate of the Ethiopian highlands, this logistical support would prove as vital as any weapon. The night of February 29th passed in tense preparation. Italian soldiers struggled through, exhausted from their approach unfamiliar terrain, with inadequate maps and failing equipment. Many units became separated in the darkness, losing contact with higher command. The complex battle plan that looked elegant on paper was already falling apart before the first shot was fired. Ethiopian warriors, by contrast, rested in positions they had prepared and knew intimately. They had spent days studying the ground, identifying fields of fire, planning withdrawal routes, and coordinating interlocking defenses. While Italian officers struggled to maintain communication with scattered units, Ethiopian commanders moved confidently through terrain they had mapped in detail. As dawn approached on March 1st, the fundamental asymmetry of the situation became clear. The Italians advanced in ignorance, their forces divided, and their intelligence compromised. The Ethiopians waited in prepared positions, unified under brilliant leadership and equipped with weapons that European racism had convinced them no African army could possess. The opening moves of the battle would determine everything. Baratieri's plan called for a coordinated advance by 4 separate brigades, converging on Ethiopian positions from multiple directions. In theory, this would prevent Menelik from concentrating his superior numbers against any single Italian force. Each brigade would fix Ethiopian attention, while others maneuvered for decisive strikes. But theory and reality diverged catastrophically in the pre-dawn darkness. The Arimondi Brigade, advancing through broken terrain, overshot its designated position and stumbled directly into the main Ethiopian encampment. Instead of achieving surprise, they found themselves surrounded by thousands of armed warriors who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Menelik, observing from his command position, immediately grasped the opportunity. Rather than allowing the Italians to coordinate their scattered forces, he would destroy them piecemeal. The tactical doctrine was simple but devastating. Use superior numbers to overwhelm isolated Italian units before they could support each other. The sound that shattered the highland dawn was not the disciplined volleys European military manuals described. It was the roar of tens of thousands of modern rifles opening fire simultaneously, backed by the rapid thunder of Hotchkiss artillery pieces that could fire faster than anything in the Italian arsenal. General Albertone's brigade, advancing to support Arimondi, found themselves caught in a separate engagement as Ethiopian forces flowed around both flanks. The carefully planned Italian advance was disintegrating into a series of desperate holding actions as each brigade fought for survival against overwhelming odds. What made the Ethiopian assault so devastating was not just superior numbers, but superior coordination. While Italian units struggled to communicate across broken terrain, Ethiopian commanders maintained contact through traditional signaling methods that European technology could not intercept or disrupt. The result was a level of tactical coordination that stunned Italian observers. By mid-morning, the battle had become a rout. Italian formations, designed for European warfare against similarly organized enemies, crumbled under assaults that came from unexpected directions with overwhelming force. The technological advantages that had seemed so decisive on paper proved meaningless when outnumbered 10-1 by equally well-armed opponents who knew the terrain intimately. The retreat began before noon, as scattered Italian survivors fled toward Eritrea in growing panic. The collapse came swiftly, like a dam bursting under pressure that had been building for hours. What had begun as a coordinated Italian advance dissolved into chaos as panicked soldiers abandoned their positions and fled toward the safety of Eritrean borders. The proud European formations that had marched with such confidence into Ethiopian territory now scattered like leaves before a hurricane. The Dabormida Brigade, attempting to cover the retreat of their comrades, found themselves completely surrounded on a hilltop position. Wave after wave of Ethiopian warriors surged up the slopes, their war cries echoing across the highlands as modern rifles cracked in deadly volleys. Italian artillery crews, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of incoming fire, abandoned their guns and joined the desperate flight northward. General Baratieri, watching his carefully planned offensive crumble before his eyes, made the agonizing decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The order to retreat was given, but by then it was far too late for an organized withdrawal. Italian units were scattered across miles of hostile terrain, cut off from each other and surrounded by Ethiopian forces that seemed to emerge from every ridge and valley. The pursuit was relentless and methodical. Ethiopian cavalry, particularly the feared Wallo Oromo horsemen under Ras Mikael, swept down from the hills like avenging angels. Their intimate knowledge of the terrain allowed them to cut off escape routes and trap fleeing Italian columns in narrow defiles where superior numbers could be brought to bear with devastating effect. Empress Taytu, commanding from her position with the Imperial Guard, demonstrated the strategic brilliance that had made this victory possible. As Italian forces began their retreat, she ordered her forces to seize control of the vital water sources along the escape routes. In the arid landscape of northern Ethiopia, access to water meant the difference between life and death for the fleeing soldiers. Her tactical masterstroke ensured that even those Italians who escaped the immediate battlefield would face death by thirst in the highlands. The scenes of carnage that unfolded across the Ethiopian countryside defied every European assumption about African warfare. This was not the disorganized slaughter that colonial troops had come to expect when facing indigenous forces. Ethiopian units advanced with discipline and purpose, coordinating their attacks with precision that would have impressed European military observers if they had not been so busy fleeing for their lives. By early afternoon, the magnitude of the disaster became clear to surviving Italian officers. Entire brigades had simply vanished, swallowed by the highland terrain and the tide of Ethiopian warriors. Communication with Rome had been severed, supply lines had been cut, and the dream of Italian colonial expansion in East Africa lay in ruins across the battlefield. The human cost was staggering on both sides, but the proportional losses told the story of the battle's decisive nature. Over 6,000 Italian and colonial troops lay dead on the Ethiopian highlands, while nearly 4,000 more had been captured. Among the dead were some of Italy's most experienced colonial officers, men who had spent years building the military infrastructure that was supposed to guarantee European dominance in Africa. Ethiopian casualties, while significant in absolute numbers, represented a far smaller percentage of Menelik's massive army. Between 4,000 and 7,000 Ethiopian warriors had paid the ultimate price for their nation's independence, while over 10,000 more bore wounds that would mark them as veterans of humanity's most significant anti-colonial victory. But these losses, heavy as they were, paled in comparison to the strategic triumph they had achieved. The treatment of prisoners revealed the complex racial and political dynamics that had driven the conflict from its beginning. Italian officers, captured in significant numbers for the first time in African colonial warfare, found themselves at the mercy of the very people they had dismissed as barbaric and inferior. The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be overstated. For the first time in the age of European expansion, white men knelt before black captors in substantial numbers. General Albertone, commander of one of the destroyed brigades, was taken into the personal custody of Azaj Zamanel, commander of Empress Taytu's army. The Ethiopian treatment of Italian prisoners was notably civilized, providing them with tents, horses, and servants while they awaited ransom negotiations. This magnanimity stood in stark contrast to the brutal treatment often meted out to captured Africans by European colonial forces. However, Ethiopian justice was harsh for those they considered traitors to the African cause. The 800 captured Eritrean askari, African soldiers who had fought alongside the Italians, faced a terrible fate. Regarded as betrayers of their own people, they suffered the traditional punishment of amputation, losing their right hands and left feet. The sight of these mutilated men, crawling to streams to quench their thirst before dying of their wounds, served as a grim reminder of the racial tensions that had fueled the conflict. News of the disaster spread across the world with stunning speed, carried by telegraph lines that connected even remote Ethiopia to global communication networks. In Rome, the initial reports were dismissed as impossible exaggerations. No African army could inflict such a comprehensive defeat on European forces. But as confirmation arrived from multiple sources, the full scope of the catastrophe became undeniable. The political earthquake that followed shook Italy to its foundations. Prime Minister Crispi, whose aggressive telegrams had pushed Baratieri into the disastrous advance, found his government collapsing as public outrage mounted. Italian newspapers, which had confidently predicted easy victory just days earlier, now demanded explanations for the worst military defeat in the nation's brief history. King Umberto declared his birthday a day of national mourning, while funeral masses were held across Italy for the known and unknown dead. Families began publishing letters they had received from soldiers before the battle, revealing the poor conditions and genuine fear that Italian troops had experienced in the weeks leading up to the disaster. The romantic vision of colonial conquest was replaced by the grim reality of body bags and grieving widows. Italian communities across the world organized relief efforts for the families of the dead and wounded. From St. Petersburg to Buenos Aires, from London to New York, the Italian diaspora grappled with the humiliation of their homeland's defeat. The nation that had dreamed of joining the ranks of great colonial powers now faced the ridicule of European rivals who had long questioned Italy's imperial ambitions. But the global implications extended far beyond Italian national embarrassment. For the first time since the beginning of European expansion into Africa, an indigenous African army had not merely resisted colonial conquest, but had utterly destroyed a modern European military force. The psychological impact reverberated across the continent and throughout the African diaspora worldwide. European colonial administrators from Cape Town to Cairo suddenly found themselves viewing their African subjects with new eyes. If the Ethiopians could inflict such a devastating defeat on European forces, what did that mean for the supposed racial superiority that justified colonial rule? The comfortable assumptions about African military incapacity that had underpinned decades of expansion were shattered in a single day of highland combat. The victory sent shockwaves through African American communities in the United States, where news of Menelik's triumph was celebrated as proof that people of African descent could stand as equals to any European power. Churches held special services of thanksgiving, while newspapers proclaimed that the Battle of Adwa had vindicated the capabilities of the African race in the face of centuries of enslavement and oppression. European powers, recognizing the new reality, moved quickly to establish diplomatic relations with the Ethiopian Empire on terms of equality, rather than colonial subjugation. British and French delegations arrived in Addis Ababa within months, seeking treaties that would secure their colonial borders while acknowledging Ethiopian sovereignty. The balance of power in the Horn of Africa had shifted permanently, and European diplomacy had to adapt to accommodate an African empire that had proven its military prowess beyond question. The ramifications cascaded far beyond the immediate battlefield, rippling through the colonial consciousness like cracks spreading through glass. In the drawing rooms of London and the salons of Paris, European intellectuals struggled to reconcile their theories of racial hierarchy with the undeniable reality of Ethiopian victory. How could their carefully constructed narratives of African inferiority survive when faced with such overwhelming evidence to the contrary? The scramble to reinterpret the victory revealed the depths of European racial prejudice. Some observers desperately argued that Ethiopians were not truly African at all, inventing elaborate theories about their supposed Middle Eastern or Mediterranean origins. Others claimed that Italian military incompetence, rather than Ethiopian brilliance, explained the outcome. These mental gymnastics demonstrated how completely the victory had shattered European assumptions about the natural order of the world. Meanwhile, in the capitals of colonial Africa, nervous administrators began reassessing their own positions. The Ashanti in Gold Coast, the Ndebele in southern Rhodesia, and countless other African peoples who had been conquered by European forces now had proof that such conquest was not inevitable. Whispered conversations in marketplaces and around cooking fires carried news of the Ethiopian triumph, planting seeds of resistance that would germinate in decades to come. Emperor Menelik, for his part, understood that military victory alone would not guarantee Ethiopia's long-term independence. The diplomatic offensive that followed proved as brilliant as the military campaign that preceded it. Rather than gloating over Italian defeat, he moved swiftly to normalize relations with European powers, demonstrating that Ethiopia could function as a responsible member of the international community. The Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed in October 1896, formally recognized Ethiopian independence and nullified the fraudulent Treaty of Wuchale that had started the conflict. Italy agreed to pay a substantial indemnity, while Ethiopian sovereignty was acknowledged by all major European powers. For the first time since the beginning of the scramble for Africa, a European nation had been forced to negotiate with an African power as an equal. Empress Taytu's role in securing this diplomatic triumph was as crucial as her military contributions had been. Her fluency in multiple languages and deep understanding of European political dynamics made her an invaluable negotiator. She ensured that the treaty terms not only secured immediate Ethiopian independence, but also established precedents that would protect the empire's sovereignty for generations to come. The Battle of Adwa stands as proof that courage, strategic brilliance, and unity can triumph over seemingly insurmountable odds. Emperor Menelik and Empress Taytu didn't just defeat an Italian army that day, they shattered the myth of European invincibility and lit a beacon of hope that would inspire liberation movements across the globe for generations to come.